You're just a burden. Without us, you wouldn't last a week." My daughter-in-law said that right in front of my son. In the kitchen, I had repaired brick by brick with my own hands. I didn't argue. I didn't get angry. I simply set my house keys down on the table. My son lowered his head and didn't say a word. And in that exact moment, I understood a painful truth. Silence can be a form of betrayal. I walked out of the house with no suitcase, no plan, but they didn't know. That was the moment everything began to turn. Where are you listening to this story from? What city? What state? Leave a comment, hit like, so the story of an old man like me can travel farther. My name is Ronald Miller. I am 73 years old. I used to be a bridge and highway engineer in Pennsylvania, nearly 40 years standing in cold wind and concrete, measuring every distance, calculating every angle so bridges wouldn't collapse under heavy trucks. I thought I understood what a solid foundation meant. I was wrong, at least when it came to family. My wife, Margaret, passed away a little over 2 years ago. We were together nearly half a century, long enough to grow used to having someone set a cup of coffee on the table every morning and remind me to wear an extra layer when the weather turned cold. When she was gone, the house became too big, too quiet. Ethan, my son, told me I should move in with him and his wife, Laura. "You shouldn't live alone, Dad," he said. I believed it came from love. I believed him. For the first 2 years, I tried hard not to become a burden. I woke up early, made coffee, cooked breakfast. I drove Sophie, my granddaughter, to school every day because I liked listening to her talk about her classes, her literature teacher, and her dream of becoming an architect. I fixed the backyard fence, replaced light bulbs, patched the front steps. Small things, but I did them with the pride of a man who once built things far bigger. But something slowly changed over time. Thank yous became rare. Nods turned perfunctory. Then came the sighs whenever I walked slowly through the living room. Laura started frowning whenever I asked something twice. Family meals grew fewer, and when they happened, the air was so thick I could almost feel it on my skin. That dinner started like any other. Roast chicken, potatoes, a dish Margaret used to make beautifully. I tried to make it as close as I could. Laura sat scrolling on her phone. Ethan came home late. Sophie was quieter than usual. As I set the plates on the table, Laura let out a sigh. "You slow everything down," she said, her voice not lowered at all. "The whole house has to revolve around your pace." I looked up, about to say something gently, but before I could open my mouth, the next sentence slammed onto the table like a hammer. "You're just a burden." I looked at Ethan. I waited for a protest, even a single sentence. But my son stared down at his plate, as if there were something there more important than his father's dignity. I don't remember when I stood up. I only remember the soft clink of metal against wood as I placed my keys on the table. The sound was small, but in my head it echoed like a door slamming shut. Sophie looked up, her eyes wide, her lips forming the word "Grandpa." But I didn't turn back right away. I was afraid that if I did, I wouldn't be calm enough to keep going. I stepped outside into the evening cold, my breath rising in thin clouds. No suitcase, no plan, just an old car and thoughts spinning in my head. I drove without turning on the radio, letting the silence speak for itself. I thought of Margaret, of the last time she held my hand in the hospital, her voice weak but clear. She had said something about a safe, about not trusting everything just because it looked right. I nodded back then to reassure her, but I didn't truly understand. That night, the highway stretched endlessly. Headlights reflected off the wet pavement, long bands of light sliding forward. I realized my heart wasn't racing. On the contrary, it was strangely calm, as if some part of me had been waiting for this moment. I thought about the house Ethan was living in, the walls I had helped paint, The porch I had repaired. And then, in the middle of that chaos, one thought surfaced, so clear it made me grip the steering wheel tighter. That house. The house Laura had just declared was hers. The house my son believed he was building a future in. I knew exactly which papers had been signed and which ones had never existed. And in that moment, I understood something they didn't. The house they were living in had never belonged to them. That thought stuck with me like a nail driven into wood. Not loud, not immediately painful, but sharpening my focus with every mile. I kept driving, both hands firm on the wheel like when I used to stand on job sites, my eyes following the white lines down the center of the road, as if drifting even slightly would make everything collapse. Late autumn nights in Pennsylvania have a cold that reminds you of scraping ice off a windshield in silence. I drove along empty stretches, passing the occasional gas station glowing in the dark, a few interstate trucks rumbling by, tires hissing softly on damp asphalt. I didn't have a specific destination, but the wheels kept pulling me toward something familiar, toward a place I hadn't stepped into for 2 years, toward the house Margaret and I had built back when our hair was dark and our arms strong enough to carry long planks without help. I stopped at a roadside gas station and bought a cup of hot coffee. The cheap smell usually made me grimace, but that night I needed warmth more than flavor. I stood under the awning, watching my breath fade into the air, then watched my phone light up again and again. Ethan called. I let it ring. Laura called. I didn't answer. Unknown numbers flashed and disappeared, as if someone were trying to grab my attention by any means necessary. I didn't want to respond yet. I needed to keep my head clear, because I knew one wrong word, one hot reaction, could throw everything off the course Margaret had warned me about. I got back in the car and kept driving. The night passed slowly. There were stretches of road I knew by heart from years ago, when I used to drive Margaret to visit her mother on Thanksgiving, the car filled with pumpkin pie and a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums. Now the passenger seat was empty. Strangely, that emptiness didn't break me. It felt more like a pause, a space where I could finally hear my own voice, a man who had lived too long trying not to inconvenience anyone. As the sky began to pale, I realized I was turning onto the small road leading to the old neighborhood. The maple trees lining the street had shed most of their leaves, only a few deep red ones clinging on, as if trying to hold the season in place. I slowed down, looking through the window. House numbers, lawns, the mailbox at the end of the driveway, all of it tightened my chest for a brief moment. The house appeared after the bend, like an old person waiting patiently and silently. It didn't look as good as it once had. The grass was ankle-high, shrubs by the porch overgrown, paint peeling off the shutters. But the frame was solid, the roof straight, the walls firm. It was the kind of sturdiness Margaret and I had calculated for everything, from the roof pitch so snow would slide off to the drainage so rain wouldn't rot the foundation. I shut off the engine and sat there for a long time. My fingers touched the keyring and found one old, worn key. That key had been with me since the house was finished. I had thought I left the past behind here when I moved in with Ethan. But the past never stays where you leave it. It waits for you to come back when you're hurt enough to face it. While I sat in the car, dozens of miles away, Laura was waking up in the house she had just declared hers. I didn't witness it, but Sophie later told me, her voice flat, like someone who had practiced not being shocked anymore. Laura walked into the kitchen in a thin robe, her hair loosely tied, still carrying the smug satisfaction from the night before. She poured coffee and called a friend. Her laughter rang through the kitchen like metal tapping glass. I told him straight. He slowed the whole house down. And he just left on his own, Laura said, emphasizing every word like she was recounting a victory. Finally, this house is really mine. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, silent. My son has a habit of sitting still like that when he doesn't want to face something. He pretended to read news on his phone, but his eyes weren't focused. He was still wearing his sleep shirt, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if something heavy were pressing down on him. Laura finished her call, hung up, and turned to Ethan. "Now let's finish the paperwork. I want everything clear," she said lightly, as if discussing buying a new rug. "What paperwork?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse, like someone who hadn't slept well. Laura shook her head with that familiar, irritated sigh. "The house, the accounts, everything related. Your dad's gone, so things should go to the people who stayed." She walked straight into the small office off the living room and pulled open the file cabinet. Binders, labeled folders, bills, insurance papers, tax records, all neatly arranged. For 2 years I had quietly organized them because I couldn't stand clutter. I thought I was helping. I didn't realize I was leaving the trail of truth right in the hands of someone who wanted to erase me from that house. Laura searched like someone who had waited for this moment a long time. She pulled out a thick folder labeled Property and opened it, her eyes scanning quickly. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. Sophie said her mother went completely still, a silence more frightening than any scream. Laura read it again, as if she thought she had misread. She jumped to her feet, her hands shaking so badly the thin paper trembled. On it was a clear line, the kind every notary office uses. Ronald Miller, sole owner. "Ethan!" Laura screamed, her voice tearing through the room. "Get over here now!" Ethan walked in, still holding his coffee mug. He looked at the paper, blinking. The crease in his brow wasn't anger, it was confusion. "What is this?" Laura shoved the paper toward him. "Did you know? Did you know this house is in your father's name?" Ethan stared, and something in his face shifted. Not the familiar avoiding silence, but a very real fear. He stammered like a child caught in a lie he didn't even realize he had told. You said my mom had taken care of everything. You said the paperwork was already transferred," Ethan said, his voice shrinking. Laura froze for a second, then her eyes darkened. "You really believe that? You live here, pay for things, work every day, think this is your house, and you never looked at the papers?" Ethan went rigid. He didn't answer. I could imagine that moment clearly, because I had seen Ethan freeze like that many times before whenever Laura raised her voice. But what froze him wasn't just fear of his wife. It was the feeling of being deceived in his own life. I, at the old house, finally opened the car door and stepped out. Morning dew clung to the porch steps. I walked slowly, hearing the boards creak under my feet, right at the spot I had always promised to fix, but kept putting off because life got in the way. I slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, as if it had never left my hand. I turned it. The door opened with a soft sound, and the smell of the house rushed out, tightening my throat. The scent of cedar, old dust, and something deeply familiar, as if time had preserved a piece of Margaret here. I stepped inside and gently closed the door behind me. Morning light filtered through the curtains, falling across the wood floor, the framed photos in the hallway, the armchair by the window where Margaret used to read. Everything was still, but not cold. It felt like a room holding its breath, waiting for me to return so the story could continue. I rested my hand on the table by the door, feeling the thin layer of dust. On the wall, the pencil mark I made long ago to measure Ethan's height when he was little was still there, faded but visible. I stood there for a moment, then let out a slow breath. Outside, the world was in chaos over a truth they had just discovered. Inside this house, I heard more clearly than ever the echo of an old warning. Margaret had left something behind. Not so I could take revenge, but so I wouldn't be swallowed by people who mistook kindness for weakness. I stopped in front of the winter coat closet at the end of the hallway, where Margaret always hung coats by color and paired gloves carefully, never letting one go missing. The door made a dry sound as I opened it, as if it didn't want to be disturbed after so long. I pushed the heavy coats aside, the smell of old fabric and wood rising, and reached deep into the back where light never touched. My fingers hit something cold, flat, solid. I knew the feeling. A fireproof safe, the kind that can withstand heat and water, which Margaret had insisted we buy the day we signed our last mortgage. I had laughed back then, said she worried too much. She hadn't laughed, just looked at me for a long moment and said, "It's not worrying. I just don't want our child to have to worry later." I pulled it out. It was heavier than I remembered, or maybe my back wasn't what it used to be. I set it on the floor, crouched down, breathing slowly, then turned the dial. The numbers came back to me without effort. Our wedding date, her birthday, the year Ethan was born. A soft click sounded. The lid opened. Inside there was no gold, no jewelry, nothing shiny like people imagine, just neatly stacked papers in moisture-proof sleeves. And on top, a cream-colored envelope, the handwriting so familiar my chest tightened instantly. Ronald. Just my name, written in her hand. Slightly slanted, steady, the same way Margaret wrote grocery lists every weekend. I picked up the envelope, touching the paper as if touching a part of her. The house was silent, but inside me something began to move, like an old machine being oiled after years of neglect. I didn't open it right away. I stood up, carried the envelope and the safe into the living room, and sat in the armchair by the window where Margaret used to sit. Morning light fell across my hands, highlighting blue veins and old calluses on my fingers. I took a deep breath, then carefully slit the envelope open. Meanwhile, back at the house on Maple Ridge, Laura had lost her smug laughter. After the shock of seeing my name on the deed, she tore through the file cabinet like a drowning person grabbing for driftwood, pulling folder after folder onto the table. Sophie said her mother flipped through papers so fast they rustled non-stop, like dry leaves being crushed. Laura found a thick legal file, clipped in black, the first page filled with dense legal language. Her eyes scanned it, then stopped suddenly at a bolded section. Beside it was Margaret's signature, the same handwriting as on the envelope I was holding. Ethan stood nearby, trying to stay composed, but when he saw Laura's face drain of color, he felt the ground slipping away beneath him. "Read it," Laura said hoarsely. "Read this part." Ethan leaned over. Sophie stood on the stairs, her back against the wooden railing, her eyes never leaving her parents'. She didn't speak. She just watched, as if memorizing every detail to understand later how everything had fallen apart. Laura ground out each word, as if she couldn't believe she had to say it aloud. They are permitted to reside in the house as guests, not tenants, no ownership rights, and the right of residence may be revoked at any time with 30 days written notice. Ethan looked up, his gaze drifting for a beat. "Guests?" he asked, as if repeating it to be sure he hadn't misheard. "How can we be guests?" Laura slammed the stack of papers onto the table. "You're asking how we're guests? It means we've been living here on someone else's goodwill. 5 years, Ethan, 5 years." Her voice shot up, then burst into a rage she could no longer control. "He's been deceiving us all these years!" That scream tore through the house. Sophie said everything seemed to freeze in that moment. Even the wall clock felt like it slowed down. Ethan didn't react right away. He just stood there, his mouth slightly open, his eyes slowly reddening, unsure whether it was anger or shame taking over. You said my mom had taken care of everything," Ethan murmured weakly, as if still clinging to the old story he had lived with for so long. "You said the house would be ours. You said—" "I said it to put your mind at ease," Laura cut in, but even she could hear how hollow that sounded. For a brief moment, her eyes wavered, as if reality had struck her across the face. Then she rushed back into the office, dragging out more documents, searching for something, anything that might save the situation, as if one more page could reverse it all. Ethan watched her, and he didn't follow to placate her. Sophie saw her father set his coffee mug down, his hand trembling slightly. He muttered a sentence Laura didn't hear, but Sophie did, standing near the stairs. "We never owned anything at all." At the same time, I sat in the old house and opened Margaret's letter. The first page was handwritten, direct and unembellished, and the very first sentence made my throat tighten instantly. "If you're reading this letter, it means they've made their move." I stared at the line as if looking long enough might make Margaret step out from the corner of the room, place a hand on my shoulder, and tell me everything was all right. But there was only light and silence. I kept reading, each line pulling me through a door I had never known existed within my own marriage. Margaret wrote that she had noticed Laura early on, not out of malice, but out of the instinct of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the particular coldness that always comes with greed. She wrote about Laura's questions that sounded casual but always circled money, documents, assets, whose name was on what. She wrote that she hadn't told me because I was too straightforward. I would confront things head-on. And when I confronted someone like Laura, that kind of person would retreat, change masks, or disappear before leaving evidence behind. "I didn't want you dragged into that fight while you were still hurting over me," Margaret wrote. "So I chose to carry the ugly part myself." I swallowed hard, my eyes burning. I looked at the uneven lines where she had written quickly, as if afraid time would run out. She said she had prepared everything with a lawyer, someone she trusted, someone who understood how to protect older people from those who know how to use family ties as a trap. She listed the firm's name, a phone number, and underlined one sentence more heavily than the rest. "When you're ready, call. Don't delay." I reached the end of the second page and my hand stopped. Margaret mentioned a name, not Laura's, not Ethan's, and not Sophie's. A completely unfamiliar name that sent a chill up my spine even though sunlight was pouring directly onto my face. I repeated the name softly, testing whether I had misread it, but Margaret's handwriting was clear and deliberate, like a period at the end of a sentence that allowed no argument. And I understood then that this wasn't just chaos in a kitchen between me and my daughter-in-law. Someone else stood behind it. A shadow Margaret had seen, had named precisely, while I had never even known it existed. That unfamiliar name sat quietly on the page, but it made the room feel smaller. I looked around as if an answer might be waiting in some corner, as if Margaret might step out, lay her hand over mine, and explain gently, the way she always did when I struggled with things that belonged to people rather than reinforced concrete. I started reading again from the beginning, more slowly. Every line felt like her voice whispering at my ear, the voice I had heard for half a century, waking me early, reminding me to bring a coat, sighing when I forgot to eat lunch because I was buried in work. Margaret wrote that she had suspected Laura from the very first day Ethan brought her home. Not because Laura was rude, not because of how she spoke. On the contrary, Laura was too right in all the ways people tend to trust. She smiled just enough, asked just enough questions, praised the house just enough, hugged Margaret as if she had already been a daughter in the family for years. But Margaret noticed something I never had. The way Laura observed. "She doesn't look at a kitchen the way a woman looks at a place she'll cook in," Margaret wrote. "She looks like she's calculating square footage, like she's appraising." I paused. I remembered an afternoon when Laura stood by the living room window, gazing into the backyard, then casually asked whether property values in the area were rising quickly. I had answered like a foolish old engineer, rambling about zoning and a new highway project. I thought it was idle conversation. Margaret didn't. She wrote that Laura's questions always returned to the same axis. Whose name was on the house? Who paid the insurance? Where savings were kept? Margaret mentioned that Laura once accidentally brought up how older people are often scammed, as if to plant fear, then kindly suggested Ethan should manage the paperwork to make things easier. Reading that, my hands went cold. But what truly stunned me came next. Margaret wrote plainly, without detours, as if she had been waiting for me to reach this day. "You'll hate me for what I've done, but I'd rather have you angry with me than let them take everything from you." She wrote that she had quietly hired a private investigator. I sat motionless. My Margaret, a woman who had trusted kindness her entire life, who baked cookies for neighbors and wrote thank you cards by hand, had hired a detective. A quiet, ruthless act from someone backed into a corner. I read carefully, feeling both pain and a strange sense of satisfaction. Not satisfaction at someone being exposed, but relief at finally understanding why Margaret had always remained calm. She wasn't powerless. She had been fighting, just in a way I never saw. Margaret wrote that Laura was not her real name. She didn't put the real name on the first line, as if she knew that by the time I reached this point, my heart would already be racing. Then she wrote it clearly, deliberately, as if hammering it into the paper. She once used another name, and she was involved in a murky inheritance case in another state. I had to set the letter down, pressing my hand to my face, feeling as if my skin had thinned. I had always thought stories like that belonged on evening news programs, or in cautionary tales people told to scare one another. Yet it had been sitting at my dinner table, holding my plate, calling me a burden. Margaret described the incident with just enough detail for me to understand without drowning in specifics. An older man in another state, widowed, no children, with a modest estate, enough to tempt someone. Laura, under her real name, approached him, appeared as a friend, then gradually as a caregiver. In a short period of time, documents changed. A will was rewritten. Then the man passed away. Distant relatives challenged it, but lacked enough evidence to win. Laura took the money, disappeared, changed her name, moved states. I swallowed hard. I thought about the way Laura looked at me. Not with hatred, not with affection, but with that cold, measuring gaze Margaret had described. Calculating. Margaret wrote that she hadn't told me because I would have confronted Laura directly, flaring up like fire. She knew me. I had spent my life solving problems by standing straight and speaking plainly. But people like Laura don't play by those rules. They slip, they twist. They know how to turn good people into villains with a few accusations. Margaret chose silence not out of fear, but because she wanted to set a stronger trap. She wrote about creating a trust, placing all assets under my name. The house, the accounts, the insurance, everything structured clearly so no one could accidentally intrude. She wrote as if drafting a blueprint, every anchor point, every exit. And at the end of the letter, she left a phone number and a name. A lawyer. I stared at the number for a long time. Outside, wind moved through the branches by the window, leaves rustling softly like whispers. I took out my phone. My finger paused for a beat before dialing. I wasn't someone who called lawyers. I had spent my life with engineers, laborers, drawings, and standards. But my life had crossed into a new territory, where law and paperwork were the battlefield. I dialed. The phone rang twice, then a steady female voice answered, unhurried and unforced. "Harper & Associates Law Office. This is Diane Harper." I inhaled. "My name is Ronald Miller. My wife, Margaret Miller, left me this number. She said I should call if they made their move." There was a brief pause on the other end. Just one beat, but enough for me to know Margaret's name carried weight there. "Mr. Miller," the woman said, her tone shifting, firmer, sharper, like someone setting a heavy file on a desk. I've been expecting your call. My spine tightened. You know about this? I know more than you think, Diane replied calmly. Margaret prepared for a long time. She didn't want me to reach out first because she believed you wouldn't be ready yet. But if you're calling now, it means things are unfolding exactly as she predicted. I looked down at the letter open on my lap. What do I need to do? First, where are you right now? Are you safe? Diane asked, not as small talk, but as someone who had seen situations spiral further than expected. I'm at the old house, I said. Alone. Good, she said, then paused slightly, choosing her words. Listen carefully, Ronald. You haven't seen even half of what your wife prepared. That sentence landed like a hidden door swinging open. I gripped the phone tighter, my heart beating harder. If this was only half, then what was the rest? And how deeply had Laura embedded herself in my life without my knowing? I barely slept that night. Not out of fear, but because my mind kept running like an engine left on. Diane's voice echoed in my ears, her words pulling me out of the last of my innocence. I hadn't seen even half of what Margaret had prepared. The next morning, I drove to Diane's office using the address she sent. It was a 2-story red brick building on the edge of town, unassuming, no flashy signs. Just a small brass plaque with the firm's name and a green potted plant by the door, simple and solid, like the kind of place that relies on documents, not advertising. Diane Harper opened the conference room door as I arrived. She was in her early 60s, gray hair neatly cut, eyes sharp but not cold. She shook my hand firmly and invited me to sit. 2 cups of coffee and a thick file already sat on the table, labeled in handwriting, Miller. Margaret liked to keep things organized, she said, looking at the file like an old acquaintance. I kept my voice steady. How long have you known about this? Almost 2 years, Diane replied. Margaret came to me when her health began to decline. She didn't want to worry you or trigger an instinctive reaction. She said, you're a good man, and sometimes that goodness makes you vulnerable. I looked down at my hands, fingers that had drawn hundreds of blueprints, now trembling slightly with anger and grief. She was right. Diane opened the file and laid out document after document, speaking slowly and clearly. She explained the trust, the guest residency clause, the right to revoke, the separated accounts. Nearly every sentence ended with the word legally, like a stamp on everything Margaret had done. I need you to understand this, Diane emphasized, tapping the papers lightly. There's no trickery here, no deception of your son. Margaret did exactly one thing. She protected the legal owner of the assets, you, from manipulation, and every step was completely lawful. Part of me wanted to feel relief. Another part ached, because if it was all lawful, it meant Margaret had lived quietly with suspicion and worry, fighting illness while building walls to protect me. I felt like a man who arrived late to a battle his wife had nearly finished alone. Diane slid a large envelope and a prepared notice toward me. This is the revocation of residency, she said. If you sign it, they'll have 30 days to vacate the house. I'll send it by certified mail, signature required. Everything by the book. No one can claim you evicted them without warning. I read the clean, direct lines, feeling like I was holding a hammer. Not to smash, but to pull a rusted nail that had been lodged in my life for too long. I looked up. I'll sign it and send it immediately, as soon as possible. Diane didn't look surprised. She simply set the pen in front of me, then said something that made me pause. Don't rush, Ronald. Not in the way you're used to finishing things. She met my eyes, her voice calm but firm. Let her reveal herself. People like Laura, when cornered, make foolish moves. We need her to walk into her own mistake. I tightened my grip on the pen. I don't want loud revenge. And you won't need it, Diane replied. You just need to stop shielding her. Stop being the one who carries everything so others can live comfortably. You don't have to do anything dramatic. Just exercise your rights and be patient." I looked again at the notice. 30 days. A number humane enough not to be cruel, firm enough not to drag on. I signed my name. My handwriting shook slightly, not from fear, but from finally accepting that I couldn't keep the peace by letting others trample my dignity. Diane took the signed document and clipped it into the file. "I'll send this today. Go home and rest. And most importantly, do not contact Laura directly. Leave everything to me." I stood up, thanked her, and stepped outside. The air was cold, the sunlight pale. I pulled my collar up and felt my age for real, but not the kind of old that gets led around by the nose. Margaret had left me something more valuable than money. She left me a plan, and she left me the courage to follow it. While I was leaving the law office, back at the house on Maple Ridge, Laura was shifting from panic into frenzy. She was calling everywhere, banks, utility companies, as if changing a few account names could somehow transfer ownership of another person's life. But every time, it came down to the same simple question. "Are you the account holder?" And every time she choked. Ethan, as vividly as I could picture it, was probably pacing between the living room and the kitchen, rubbing his forehead, staring into space like someone waking up from a dream. He was caught between two things: the cold truth on paper and the story Laura had been telling for years. I didn't know which way he was leaning. I only knew he was no longer standing as steady as before. And Sophie stayed quiet. She had always been the quiet one in the house, the kind of kid who listens more than she talks. I remembered her eyes the day I left. Not angry. The eyes of a child trying to understand why adults hurt each other this way. Late afternoon, I returned to the old house. I walked a slow loop around the backyard, looking at the old maple tree, the weathered wooden fence. I went into the kitchen, turned on the light, and without meaning to, looked up at the hook where Margaret used to hang her scarf. It was empty. I stood there longer than necessary. Then my phone vibrated. A missed call from an unknown number. I didn't call back. I remembered Diane's words. I left it alone. I made a simple dinner, ate by myself, washed the dishes, then sat in the living room. The clock crept forward. Outside the window, wind rattled against the porch with a steady clatter, like someone tapping out a rhythm. Near midnight, just as I was about to turn off the lights, my phone vibrated again, a text. The name on the screen made my chest tighten. Sophie. I opened it, and there was only one short line, written like someone afraid to breathe too loudly. "Grandpa, if Mom finds out I'm texting, she'll snatch my phone. But I have to tell you something. Can you listen to me right now?" I stared at the screen, as if looking longer might turn the words into an apology, or an innocent teenage misunderstanding. But no. Sophie's message stayed there, trembling and urgent, like a knock in the middle of the night. I replied immediately, typing slowly so I wouldn't misspell anything. "I'm listening. Where are you? Are you safe?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then appeared again. I could hear my own heartbeat in the quiet house. "I'm in my room. Mom and Dad are fighting downstairs. Mom's drinking. I'm scared." I swallowed hard. I didn't want to call the police. I didn't want to turn a family matter into a public scene on the street. But I also couldn't leave her alone with that fear. "Listen to me," I typed. "Lock your bedroom door. Put your phone on silent. If anything happens, text the word urgent and I'll come immediately." A moment later, Sophie sent an address and added one more short line. "Tomorrow after school, meet me at the diner near Route 7. I'll find a way to walk there." I read the words, "find a way," over and over, and it hurt. A 16-year-old shouldn't have to find a way to escape her own house just to see her grandfather. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. I made coffee, but only managed a few sips before setting it down. I paced between the living room and the kitchen, checking the clock like the minute hand was moving slower than normal. Near midday, I put on a heavy coat, a knit cap, and drove out of town. The road toward the outskirts was quieter, flanked by dormant fields and bare trees, silent like old men guarding secrets. The diner Sophie mentioned sat beside a small gas station, the kind with an old neon sign and slightly fogged windows from the kitchen heat. The smell of bacon and cheap coffee drifted all the way into the parking lot, a familiar American scent I'd known my whole life. I chose a corner booth facing the door and ordered a black coffee so I'd have a reason to sit. I saw Sophie the moment she walked in. She wore a gray hoodie, her hair tied back hastily, dark circles under her eyes like someone who hadn't slept. She scanned the room, spotted me, and hurried over, sliding into the booth across from me without asking. "Grandpa," she said, her voice quiet but steady, like she'd practiced the word in her head. I wanted to reach out and take her hand right away, but I held myself back, just nodded and asked gently, "Are you okay?" Sophie shook her head very slightly. She placed both hands on the table, trying to keep them from trembling. When she looked up, I saw something in her eyes I'd once seen in Margaret on her weakest days. Not tears, but determination born of fear. "I heard it," Sophie said. "Last night, after you left. Mom thought I was asleep." I leaned forward just a little. "Heard what?" Sophie took a breath as if pulling air from deep in her chest. She was on the phone, talking to someone. Her voice was different, not how she sounds in front of people. She swallowed. She laughed, and she said, "Oh, just wait for him to die. We just have to wait." My throat tightened, but I forced myself not to react too strongly. I didn't want Sophie to think she'd handed me a bomb and I was about to set it off. "Are you sure?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Sophie nodded, then her voice stumbled on the next sentence like she was afraid to repeat it. She said you were just a temporary obstacle. That phrase landed like a dull knife. It didn't cut cleanly. It dragged, hurting longer. I looked at Sophie and saw her lips pressed tight. She wasn't just scared for me. She was ashamed that this was her mother. "I'm sorry," I said, and the words came more naturally than anything else. "I'm sorry you had to hear something like that." Sophie blinked rapidly, then pulled out her phone. She glanced toward the door once more, as if afraid someone might walk in, then slid the screen toward me. "I have this," she said. On the screen were photos of text messages, short, plain, cold as receipts. "Got the old man out. Don't rush. Wait for the right moment. As soon as he's gone, everything will go smoothly." In another message, the reply was blunt. "Keep Ethan compliant. Don't let him suspect." I read each line, feeling like I was staring at a blueprint for something rotten. This wasn't a burst of anger, not a careless sentence at dinner. This was a plan, structured, guided, someone waiting for results. I slid the phone back to Sophie, keeping my voice steady. "Where did you get these?" Sophie answered quickly, as if rehearsed. Mom left her phone charging in the kitchen. The messages popped up on the screen. I took pictures and emailed them to myself. I was scared she'd delete them. She lowered her head. "I don't know if that was wrong." "No," I said immediately. "You did the right thing. You protected the truth." Sophie clutched her phone. "Grandpa, I don't want to go home anymore." The sentence dropped onto the table like a heavy weight. I looked at her and saw both a plea and a confession in her eyes. I understood that feeling, when a place that used to be home becomes somewhere you listen for footsteps. "I want to stay with you," Sophie continued, her voice shaking but not retreating. "I can't take it anymore. Mom, she looks at you like an object. She looks at Dad like a bridge. She looks at me." She stopped, as if unwilling to finish, then forced the words out. "She says I have to be on her side, that we're a team, but I don't want that." I placed my hand on the table near hers, not touching yet, just close enough for her to know I was there. "You'll stay with me," I said. "If that's what you want, I'll take you home." Sophie let out a breath, like she'd been holding it for months. Then her expression darkened again. She lowered her voice even further. "There's one more thing," she said. "Mom isn't doing this alone." A chill ran up my spine. "What do you mean?" Sophie glanced toward the door, then back at me, speaking each word as if afraid saying it might make it real. "She has an ally. I don't know who, but I heard her call them. The one who helps plan. She said that person knows what to do with old people to make things look natural." I kept my face calm, but inside everything shifted. Diane had been right. I didn't need loud revenge. I needed patience, and I needed to protect Sophie. I took out my phone and sent Diane a short message, enough for her to understand without a long explanation. "Sophie has text message evidence. There's a third party. I'm bringing her to stay with me now." I looked at Sophie. "Eat something first. Then I'll take you." Sophie shook her head. "I'm not hungry." "Neither am I," I said, standing up and paying for the coffee. "But you need some strength. I don't want you passing out on the way." She nodded slightly, trusting me. I ordered 2 sandwiches to go, so she'd have something in her hands, something ordinary to remind her the world still had normal pieces, even while everything else was unraveling. When we stepped into the parking lot, cold wind cut across us. Sophie pulled her hood down lower. I opened the car door for her, then took the driver's seat. Before starting the engine, I looked at her. "Listen to me," I said. "From today on, I won't let anyone turn you into a pawn. You just tell the truth and keep yourself safe. I'll handle the rest." Sophie nodded, her eyes red but dry. And as I pulled the car onto the road, I understood something clearly. The patience game had entered a new phase. Because now it wasn't just my dignity at stake, it was my granddaughter's safety. And whoever stood behind Laura was still somewhere in the shadows. We reached my house at dusk. Sophie sat quietly in the passenger seat, the sandwich still untouched in its paper bag, as if simply leaving that other house had already lifted half the weight from her shoulders. I didn't ask anything else on the drive. I was afraid one question might make her break. As soon as we stepped inside, I turned on the porch light and let Sophie enter first. The smell of old wood, familiar hand soap, the steady ticking of the wall clock, it all felt like reassurance. I led her into the living room and pointed to the armchair by the fireplace. "Sit here. I'll heat some milk. Then you eat a little, even just a few bites." Sophie nodded. She looked around like someone who'd escaped a noisy place and wasn't yet used to the quiet. I hadn't even set the kettle on the stove when my phone vibrated. Diane's message was brief. "Keep Sophie with you. I'll arrange things tomorrow. And don't be surprised if Laura counterattacks immediately." I stared at the words for a moment, not because I was shocked, but because I could already see exactly what someone like Laura would do when cornered. She wouldn't apologize. She'd switch roles, turn herself into the victim, and make me the aggressor. I set the phone down and focused on small tasks: warm milk, a thin blanket for Sophie, a pillow for her back. I asked which room she wanted. She chose the small bedroom at the end of the hall, the one Ethan had slept in as a boy. I changed the sheets, set a nightlight by the bed, and said gently, "If you need anything, knock. I don't sleep deeply." Sophie stood in the doorway as if wanting to say more, then only said, "Thank you, Grandpa." I nodded. "You don't need to thank me. You just need to be safe." When Sophie's door closed, I finally let out a long breath. I stepped onto the back porch and looked out into the dark yard, where the old maple stood still, its bare branches like fingers braced against the sky. I thought of Margaret. If she were still here, she wouldn't shout. She would do exactly what she had always done. Prepare ahead, quietly and carefully, so that when the moment came, everything fell into place. Around 9 in the evening, my phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number. I hesitated for a second, then answered. Laura's voice came through, sweet to the point of being fake. "Ronald, what do you think you're doing? You took Sophie without a word. Do you know that's kidnapping?" I kept my voice even. "Sophie came to me on her own. She chose to come with me. She left a message. You know that." "Don't act innocent," Laura cut in, her tone sharpening. "You're old. You're confused. You think you still control everyone?" I heard something beneath her breathing. Panic pressed down hard. She was trying to hold her image together, but fear was leaking through. "Laura," I said slowly, "if you want to talk, speak with the truth. If you're calling to threaten me, I don't have time." "You'll make time," she snapped. "I've already talked to people. I'll sue. I'll prove you're not mentally sound, that you're obsessed, paranoid, that you're a danger to the girl." I stayed silent for a few seconds. I remembered Diane's words. "Don't rush. Let her expose herself." I said only one thing. "Do what you think you need to do. I will too." Then I hung up. That night, Sophie didn't fall asleep right away. I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. A moment later, the living room door cracked open, and Sophie stood there, already wearing her jacket. "Grandpa," she whispered, "Mom texted me. She said if I don't come back, she'll do everything she can to get you put into a hospital." I motioned for her to sit down. "Don't reply." "I didn't reply," Sophie said, her voice tightening. "But I'm scared, Dad. Dad will believe her." I put my hand on her shoulder. "Your dad is being pulled between two things, the truth and habit. Habit can be very strong, but the truth has its own way." Sophie pulled a small, folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket. I want to leave this with you. If they say I was manipulated by you, at least I'll have my own words." I looked at the paper. Sophie's handwriting was still young but firm. I didn't read it out loud, I just nodded. "I'll keep it, and I'll give it to Diane." Sophie exhaled, like she'd just dropped a stone from her chest. The very next morning, everything started moving fast, like a machine that had just been oiled. Diane called me at 8 a.m., her voice calm but decisive. "Laura has filed a petition for intervention. She's accusing you of being mentally unfit and under undue influence. She wants the court to review your capacity, not because she cares, but because she wants access to things she can't touch." I looked out the window, the winter sunlight thin as paper. "She moves fast." "People like that always do," Diane replied. "But don't worry, she's exposing herself." Diane was right. Over the next 2 days, I heard from a few people around town, rumors traveling like wind. Laura was searching for a lawyer everywhere. She went to this office, called that firm, sent emails, scheduled consultations. But every time, she was turned away. Some said, conflict of interest. Others said, outside our scope. Some didn't even call back. I could picture her standing at a reception desk, a polite smile glued to her face, slowly cracking as she heard, "Sorry, we can't take this case." Late in the afternoon on the third day, Diane called again. There was something in her voice that sounded like a very restrained smile. "Guess who just walked into my waiting room?" I stayed quiet for a second, then understood. "Laura?" "Exactly," Diane said. She didn't read the name on the documents carefully. Or she did, and still thought she could win me over. "I'm meeting with her in 10 minutes. "Diane," I said, "don't let yourself get put in an awkward position because of me." "Ronald," she replied, "I've spent my entire career protecting people like you from people like her. You don't need to worry." I hung up, but my nerves didn't settle. I paced the kitchen. Sophie sat at the table, trying to do homework, but her eyes kept drifting toward me. "Is something wrong, Grandpa?" I didn't want her carrying more weight. I only said, "Someone is walking straight through a door they really shouldn't." About an hour later, Diane called back. "I want you to hear this from me," she said. "Laura came in here and told a very smooth story, that you've been acting erratically, that you control the money, that you're turning Sophie against her mother. She performed well, but acting doesn't make it true." I tightened my grip on the phone. Then what? I asked her one question, Diane said, that she didn't expect. I called her by her real name. I could hear Diane's breathing like she was replaying the moment. Right at my desk, in front of my assistant, I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Are you still using that name, or would you prefer I call you by the one in your old file?" I froze. How did she react? "She went pale," Diane said, each word clear. Not angry, drained, like all the blood left her face. She tried to smile, but her mouth twisted. Then she lost control. She slammed her hand on my desk and demanded to know where I got that information. She started speaking in fragments, nothing coherent. I closed my eyes. Margaret had been right. Diane had been right. Once you call someone by their true name, the mask falls faster than anything else. "Did Ethan know?" I asked, though I already suspected. Diane paused for a beat. Ethan was with her. He sat in the corner at first, still believing, still nodding along with his wife. But when I said that name, he looked at her like he was looking at a stranger. I saw it clearly. The habit was gone. Doubt had taken its place. My heart pounded, not with satisfaction, but with sadness. Sadness that my son had to learn this lesson through so much pain. Diane continued, her tone firm. "She left my office completely unhinged, but you need to be prepared. Someone like her won't stop. When cornered, she'll go back to the person who taught her. She'll ask for help." I glanced at Sophie. She was watching me, as if she could feel the cold wind moving through the story. That evening, after Sophie went to her room, I received a text from Ethan's number. Just one sentence. "Dad, Laura just called her biological mother. I heard her say, 'Mom, you have to save me. They know everything.'" I sat still. The ally Sophie had mentioned was no longer a vague idea. It had just been named through a desperate call for help. Ethan's message left me motionless for a long time, as if all the sound in the house had been switched off. Only the ticking wall clock and the wind through the window frame remained. I thought of what Sophie had said at the diner, that her mother had an ally. Back then, I hadn't dared put a name to it. Now, her biological mother appeared as clearly as dark ink on white paper. I didn't reply to Ethan right away. I stood up, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and took a small sip to keep my hands from shaking. I was 73 years old, but blows like this could still knock the breath out of you. I looked at Margaret's photo on the wooden shelf, her smile still gentle. In the warm, yellow light, I could almost hear her reminding me, "Don't rush. Don't let anger ruin clarity." I texted Ethan back with just one sentence. "Write down anything else you hear. Don't argue over the phone." Less than 10 minutes later, Diane called. "Ronald," she said directly, "are you at home?" "I am." She just left my office and immediately called her biological mother. "It's lucky Ethan overheard, but I need you and Ethan to do something. If possible, that conversation needs to be recorded." My voice came out rough. "Recorded? Is that legal?" "In this state," Diane replied, each word precise. "Only one party in the conversation needs to consent. If Ethan is directly involved and listening, he can record. I'll guide him on how to do it properly." I sat down at the kitchen chair, my fingertips touching the cold tabletop. So the ally wasn't just one person lurking in the background. It could be a system, a taught behavior, a pattern repeated across families, towns, names. That night, Ethan called again. His voice was exhausted, stretched tight like a wire. "Dad," he whispered, "Laura's in the living room. She thinks I'm asleep, but I can hear everything." "Stay calm," I said. "Where are you right now?" "In the garage. I've started recording." I held my breath, not because I wanted to hear people tearing me apart, but because I understood that sometimes the truth needs something stronger than memory to survive. Ethan told me Laura spoke to her mother in a voice caught between panic and forced strength. She said they'd been exposed, that there was a lawyer, that her daughter had left, that everything was collapsing. Then there was a short silence, followed by the other woman's voice, cold and indifferent in a way that made your skin crawl. "You ruined the easiest job," the woman said. "A lonely old man, a weak son, a controllable granddaughter. You had every advantage, and you let them flip the board." Ethan stopped there. I pictured my son standing in the dark, each word cutting into him. I couldn't speak right away. My throat felt raw. "Dad," her voice sounded like she was grading her, Ethan continued. Not comforting, not worried, like she was scolding an employee for messing up. I closed my eyes. In my mind, the pieces locked together on their own. Laura acted like someone who'd been trained. Choose a target, build an image, isolate them, control the information, wait for the moment, then move. She didn't suddenly turn cruel. She followed a template. "Did you hear any names?" I asked. "No," Ethan said. "Laura just said, 'Mom.' But her mother said one more thing, told her not to leave traces like she did. Then she told Laura she had to leave town, cut ties completely, and if necessary, smear you." I opened my eyes and stared at the wall across from me. "Smear me? How?" Ethan swallowed. "She said she'd make people believe you're mentally unstable, that you're manipulating Sophie, that you're the one who destroyed our family." I wasn't surprised. I only felt the ache of recognition. When they can't take your assets, they take your reputation. When they can't control property, they control the narrative. I spoke to Ethan slowly, like setting a stone exactly where it needed to go. "Keep the recording. Don't delete it. Tomorrow, send it to Diane." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then asked a question I could hear breaking him. "Dad, I lived with her for almost 10 years. I didn't know any of this. Am I an idiot?" I exhaled softly. "You're not an idiot. You were led, and now you're seeing. That's enough to change everything." Ethan's voice cracked. "I'm going to confront her." I hesitated. "You don't need to charge in like you're hitting a wall. You need to be safe first." "No," Ethan said, suddenly firm. "I have to say it. I have to look at her and ask directly. If I don't, I'll live my whole life in this shadow." I understood. There are moments when people don't confront to win. They confront to reclaim themselves. The next morning, Diane asked me to come to her office. I went alone. Sophie stayed home. I told her to sleep in. She needed rest, needed something normal in days that had been torn apart. Diane's office was bright and clean, smelling of paper and coffee. She sat across from me, opened her laptop, and listened to Ethan's recording. I watched her expression change only slightly, but I noticed her eyes grow colder, more focused. "This is no longer a single-family issue," Diane said when the recording ended. "That woman's voice, the way she speaks, it matches cases I've seen before. A repeating pattern. One teacher, many operators." I asked quietly, "What are you going to do?" "Collect enough," Diane replied. "Not just to remove Laura from your life, but to stop her from repeating this with someone else. I've contacted a federal connection. I won't say names here. But you understand." I nodded. I understood all too well. Margaret had once told me my kindness was my strength, and also where people tried to exploit me. If you only push one predator out of your house but let them knock on someone else's door, that's not an ending. That's just a new target. That afternoon, Ethan called. His voice was shaking but no longer weak. "Dad, I talked to her." "Are you okay?" "I'm sitting in the car. She's inside." Ethan took a breath. I asked her, "What did you tell your mother? Who is your mother?" She laughed, said I was spying. Then I said, "I recorded it." When I said that, her face changed instantly. I could see the scene clearly, like I was standing there. One simple sentence, enough to crack the mask. "What did she say?" I asked. "She didn't apologize," Ethan said. "She switched to attacking. She said you're destroying us, said you're sick. Then she threatened me." "How?" Ethan let out a dry laugh. "She said if I leave, she'll tell the neighbors, the parents' group, everyone, that you're a child manipulator, that you forced Sophie to run away, that you're the one who ruined our marriage." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept my voice steady. "What did you say?" "I didn't yell. I just set the phone on the table and played the recording of her mother," Ethan replied. "I said, 'Listen to this. Listen to what your mother calls you. Listen to how she talks about this family, like it's a job.'" There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Ethan breathing hard, like someone who had just crossed a long stretch of road with nowhere to rest. "She stood there," Ethan went on. "She didn't cry. She didn't perform. She just looked at me like I was a traitor. Then she said, 'You think you've won? You're nothing without me.'" I closed my eyes. That sentence wasn't meant just for Ethan. It was how she saw the world. Everyone was a tool, and when a tool stopped obeying, it got smashed. "And what did you do?" I asked. Ethan let out a slow breath. "I packed my things. I told her I'd be staying at your place for a while. I talked about Sophie, said I wanted her to have peace." Laura screamed. She threw a glass against the floor. But I didn't turn back. In my mind, I heard a car door slam, an engine start, my son pulling himself out of a circle of control. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt both heavy and lighter at the same time. "I'm coming to you now," Ethan said. "But Dad, Diane says there's going to be a meeting to end everything." I looked out the window of Diane's office as I remembered it, where the light fell across the curb like a line drawn in chalk. "Yeah," I said. "That meeting, that's where every mask will have to fall." I hung up and walked to the filing cabinet in my home office. I took out a folder Diane had prepared in advance, every piece of evidence arranged in order, neat as boards that had already been planned smooth. If Laura thought she could scare me with words, she had forgotten one thing. I'd spent my whole life building bridges and roads. I knew the foundation mattered more than the noise, and now the foundation was ready. The final meeting had been set. The meeting was scheduled for a gray morning, the kind of weather Ohio gets so often in the cold season, not bright, but mercilessly clear. I arrived 15 minutes early, not because I was anxious, but because I wanted to sit quietly for a moment before stepping into a room I knew would change several lives. Diane chose a small conference room, cream-colored walls, a long wooden table with a soft shine, windows facing a parking lot where a few dust-covered cars sat motionless. On the table were 3 thick folders, a small speaker, a laptop, and a sealed brown paper envelope. Diane sat at the head of the table, posture straight, like someone used to standing firm while other lives tilted around her. Beside me was Ethan, his face hollow from sleepless nights, but his eyes were different now, no longer evasive. He looked straight ahead, even though it hurt. Sophie sat close to me. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hair neatly tied back. her hands clasped together in her lap. I could feel the tension running through her small body. I gently placed my hand over the back of Sophie's hand. She didn't say anything, just squeezed back lightly, a way of reminding me she was still here, still choosing to stand with me. The door opened exactly on time. Laura walked in first, more carefully made up than usual, wearing a light-colored coat and a delicate necklace, as if reminding herself to look harmless. Behind her came a young lawyer, dark blue suit, leather briefcase held neatly, the polite smile of someone who didn't yet know what he was about to step into. Laura scanned the room, her gaze passing over me and then lingering on Sophie a beat too long. I saw her jaw twitch slightly before she forced her expression back into calm. Ethan didn't greet her. He just sat still, shoulders rigid, holding himself together. Diane spoke first, her voice measured without any display. "We're here today to resolve two matters," she said. "First, the residency rights and property interests related to Mr. Ronald Miller. Second, the issue of safety and guardianship concerning Sophie." Laura's lawyer nodded and opened his notebook. "My client believes Mr. Miller is showing signs of cognitive decline, is being influenced by others, and has acted impulsively in ways that have harmed the family." Diane lifted a hand gently, cutting him off with perfect courtesy. "I understand. But before opinions, we'll review the evidence." She turned on the laptop, the screen facing everyone. A list of files appeared, labeled by date. I saw Ethan swallow hard. Sophie lowered her eyes to the table, as if bracing for a cold wind. Diane opened the first folder and slid a copy of the trust documents into the center of the table. The legal language lay neatly in place, dry and precise, but its meaning felt like a steel door slamming shut. "The house on Cedar Ridge," Diane said, "is owned and controlled by Ronald Miller. Ethan and Laura resided there by permission, revocable with notice." The young lawyer frowned, flipping pages. "This is a trust structure, but long-term residents can sometimes create—" "No," Diane said, still calm. "Not in this case. The clauses were drafted specifically to prevent that argument." Laura let out a sharp laugh. "Of course, she always did everything like a trap." She turned to Ethan. "You see, they planned all this to throw us out on the street." Ethan didn't respond. A deep line appeared between his brows, as if every word Laura spoke drove another nail into something already cracked. Diane opened the second folder. "These are the messages Sophie provided, and this is the recording Ethan made." Laura sat up straight immediately. "What messages? That girl, she's been coached by him. Sophie," Diane said, looking directly at her, "didn't need coaching to hear the words, 'Wait until he dies.'" The air in the room stalled. I saw Laura's hand tighten around the strap of her bag. Her lawyer glanced sideways, a professional reflex at hearing words that could push this far beyond a family dispute. Diane pressed play. The sound filled the room, slightly distorted but unmistakable. Laura's voice, her biological mother's voice. The ice-cold line, "You ruined the easiest job," echoed under the fluorescent lights. The young lawyer blinked several times. He removed his glasses, looked down at his notes, then back at Laura as if she were a stranger. Laura forced a smile. That was edited. Who doesn't say things out of frustration when a family is falling apart?" Diane didn't argue. She simply opened another file. This time it was Laura's voice saying, "Temporary obstacle," and the messages about waiting and the right time. The language carried no trace of love or concern. It sounded like a plan. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were red but dry. He turned to Laura, his voice hoarse but steady. "You called it a job." Laura sprang to her feet. "You believe them over your wife? You sit there and let them twist everything." "You twisted everything," Ethan replied, not raising his voice. For years. Sophie looked up. She didn't look at her mother. She looked at Diane, then at me, as if reminding herself not to shake. Laura's lawyer slowly set his pen down. He cleared his throat. "Ms. Miller," he said, his tone less confident now, "I need a moment to speak privately with my client." "That won't be necessary," Diane replied. "You can speak here." The young lawyer turned to Laura, his expression firm. "Ms. Miller, if these recordings and messages are authentic, I cannot continue representing you under the narrative you presented to me. This is no longer a simple civil dispute." Laura stared at him in disbelief. "Are you kidding? I'm paying you." "Money doesn't buy me the right to bury my professional integrity," he said, calmer than I expected. He stood, gathered his briefcase. "I'm withdrawing." For a moment, no one spoke. I heard the zipper of the leather bag, the sound of his shoes on the floor, the door closing, and I saw Laura go pale, as if the ground had just been pulled out from under her feet. She turned to Diane, her voice beginning to fracture. What are you going to do to me?" Diane slid a stack of papers toward her. "We're offering you a choice. You sign and leave quietly. Or you refuse, and the entire file moves forward through the proper channels. You understand what that means." Laura looked at the papers like a crack she couldn't seal. She let out a broken laugh. "He wants revenge." I spoke for the first time since she walked in. My voice was low, even without anger. "I don't need revenge. I just stopped protecting you." Laura looked at me, her eyes flashing with something between rage and desperation. "You think you've won because you're richer?" "I've won because I have the truth," I said, "and because Sophie deserves to live somewhere. She doesn't have to be afraid of hearing adults plan her grandfather's death." Sophie shivered slightly. I squeezed her hand a little tighter. Ethan stood up, placed both hands on the table, his voice shaking but clear. "Laura, enough! Sign it!" Laura looked at Ethan as if searching for the old thread to pull him back. But Ethan didn't look away. He met her gaze. Laura collapsed back into the chair. Her shoulders sagged. The pen lay in front of her. There was a silence so long I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Then Laura picked up the pen. Her hand shook as she signed each page, as if signing away her own mask. She relinquished residency rights, gave up all claims to property, accepted the arrangement for Sophie that she would live with me for the time being, in safety and stability, with all contact structured around Sophie's well-being, not adult emotions. When she finished, the pen dropped onto the table, spent. Laura stood, grabbed her bag. She glanced at Sophie, her lips tightening as if she wanted to say something, then swallowed it. Perhaps she understood that any words now would only shrink her further. The door opened. She walked out, and there was no confidence left. Only a slightly hunched back, moving quickly, as if afraid of being seen. When her footsteps faded, Ethan sat back down. He covered his face for a moment, then lowered his hands and looked at me. In his eyes was something I had waited too long to see. Not excuses, acceptance. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry." I didn't answer right away. I looked at Ethan, at Sophie, at Diane. A family isn't always saved by love. Sometimes it's saved by truth, by the cost of facing it, by one person deciding to stop being silent. I let out a long breath, then nodded, like setting a brick back into place on a cracked bridge. "Let's go home," I said. "Oh," Sophie stood with me. She moved close to my side, like someone who had finally found solid ground under her feet. And I understood that from this moment on, Laura had no path back to what she had broken. Not because I pushed her out, but because she had signed her name to the truth she'd spent so long denying. As we left Diane's office, I didn't feel relief in the sense of victory. I felt a quiet emptiness, like a house after a storm, when everything is still there but the air has changed. Sophie walked close beside me, her small shoulders tight as wire. Ethan followed a few steps behind, silent, his hand gripping his car keys until his knuckles turned white, as if letting go might make everything shatter again. On the way home, Sophie stared out the window. Bare rows of trees slid backward, the gray sky pressing low against the road. I thought about saying something, then chose not to. There are moments when words only add to the hurt. I simply reached over and turned the heater knob a little higher, letting warmth spread through the car, a quiet kind of care I had practiced my whole life. In the days that followed, everything collapsed around Laura faster than I expected. Not because I chased her down to bring her low, but because once she lost her footing, the things she clung to let go on their own. The house on Cedar Ridge, where she had once stood in the kitchen and declared, "It's finally mine," became an empty shell. She no longer had the right to stay. She no longer had the right to demand. And more than that, she no longer had the mask of the good daughter-in-law to hide what was rotting underneath. Diane gave me a list of things to do, step by step, without emotion. I signed papers that looked lifeless on the surface, my hand steady. Some signatures for an old man like me aren't ink, they're boundaries. The first time I truly felt that empire fall was when I walked into the bank downtown. The teller who knew me by name greeted me politely, just like always. I sat down, placed the documents on the desk, and said one short sentence. I want to close the secondary accounts, revoke access, and transfer all savings into the trust structure. There was no shouting, no arguing, just the sound of keyboards, the slide of paper, the dry, decisive thump of a stamp. I signed in one place, then added another signature at the bottom of the page. That was all. Everything Laura had treated as her default was locked down. Secondary cards canceled, access revoked, automatic payments stopped. Doors she believed would never close suddenly shut, softly, as if they had never been open. When I stepped out of the bank, I stood under the awning for a moment, watching cars pass by. I felt no thrill. I just saw clearly a simple truth Margaret had spoken while she was still alive. Real power is sometimes nothing more than the ability to say no and not have to explain. I sold the house on Cedar Ridge faster than I thought I would. I didn't want to keep it. Every corner held the marks of my own repairs, but it also carried insults and betrayal now. Some things aren't worth holding on to just because you once put in the work. On the day we signed the sales contract, Sophie came with me. She sat waiting in the realtor's office, arms wrapped around her backpack, eyes fixed on her shoes. When I came back out, she looked up and asked very softly, "Grandpa, are you sad?" I paused for a beat. I thought about the old years, about Margaret, about the dinner where Laura pushed me away from the table like an extra chair. I answered honestly, "I am. But being sad doesn't mean you have to stay somewhere that makes you smaller." Diane and I set up an education fund for Sophie, not to buy her future, but to return her right to choose, something selfish adults had nearly taken from her. I structured it so the fund would release money by milestones, tuition, books, housing, the essentials. I didn't want money to become another trap. Sophie listened as I explained, then nodded, her eyes shining. She didn't cry. She just tightened her grip on her backpack strap, like someone who had been handed back a piece of life she thought was gone. Ethan started coming around more often, but not like a father arriving to claim his child. He came like a man learning how to stand in his own house again. The first night Ethan came over for dinner, he brought a box of fried chicken and mashed potatoes from a place nearby, his face awkward, like a boy bringing his first girlfriend home. "I didn't know what you and Sophie like," Ethan said, tired but sincere. "We can eat this," I said. "What matters is that you came." Sophie sat across from him, silent for a while. Ethan looked at her as if he wanted to say something but didn't dare. I didn't push. I had been a father. I knew the cost of an apology spoken too late. After dinner, Ethan helped me wash dishes. I saw his hands tremble slightly when the hot water touched them, not from the heat, but from everything he was trying to swallow. "Dad," Ethan said, eyes on the soap bubbles. I let it go too far. I set a plate down and looked at my son. "You're still here. That means you can still do things differently." Ethan nodded, lips pressed tight. I knew he was trying not to cry. Men are like that. When they're young, they think not crying is strength. When they're older, they understand strength is admitting you were wrong. I went back to the workshop behind the house, the one I had abandoned when Margaret became seriously ill. The old wooden door creaked when I pushed it open. The smell of wood, machine oil, old sawdust clung to everything, like a layer of time. Sophie stood behind me, looking around as if she had stepped into something sacred. "She used to sit here," I said, pointing to the stool in the corner. "She'd read. I'd work." Sophie moved closer to the bench and touched the surface. "Can I learn?" I smiled. "You can, but you have to remember one thing." "What is it?" "Measure twice, cut once." Sophie laughed softly, the first real laugh I had heard from her since the day she left her mother's house. It was small, but to me it felt like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. We started with something simple, a picture frame. I taught Sophie how to hold a ruler, how to draw a straight line, how to listen to the sound of wood under sandpaper. She was remarkably focused. When she made a mistake, she didn't get angry. She stopped, breathed, and tried again. That patience stabbed my chest with memories of Margaret. Little by little, the house stopped being just a shelter. It became a place to live. Mornings smelled like coffee. Afternoons carried the sound of sandpaper. At night, Sophie studied at the kitchen table, Ethan stopping by now and then to fix a shelf, change a light bulb, then leaving quietly, as if rebuilding trust one brick at a time. As for Laura, she vanished from social circles like someone erased from a photograph. I heard bits and pieces through acquaintances. She was let go from her company due to restructuring, then couldn't find new work. Friends who once laughed with her began to avoid her. Parties that had been her stage no longer had room for a name that caused discomfort. The most frightening thing for someone like Laura isn't being poor. It's being treated like you don't exist. I didn't tell Sophie any of that. She didn't need to know how society had turned its back on her mother. She just needed peace to grow. Then, one rainy afternoon, while I was dusting the bookshelf in the living room, Diane called. "Mr. Ronald?" she said, her voice different, slower. "I have a letter. From Margaret." I froze, the cloth slipping from my hand. In my mind, Margaret appeared so clearly I thought I could turn and see her standing in the kitchen doorway, hair loosely tied, smiling, telling me not to forget my medication. "She instructed me," Diane continued, "to give it to you only after everything was settled." I didn't know what to say. I only heard my own voice, rough. "I'll come right away." And when I hung up, I realized something strange. The storm had passed, the house was calm, but my heart began to pound as if I were about to meet someone long gone, through a few pages of paper. I arrived at Diane's office while rain was still falling lightly. The smell of damp coats, old paper, and hot coffee blended together. That familiar scent of places where people come to resolve their lives. Diane didn't say much. She stood, closed the door, and placed a cream-colored envelope on the polished wooden table. The writing on it tightened my chest instantly. Ronald, Margaret's handwriting. Still soft, still slanted slightly to the right like a small river. It had been 2 years since I'd seen her writing, yet it felt like yesterday she was scribbling a grocery list and reminding me not to forget low-fat milk for Sophie. "She asked me," Diane said quietly, as if afraid to break the air, "to give this to you only after everything was done. I kept my word." I took the envelope with both hands. It was thin but heavy. Some things aren't heavy because of weight, but because they carry an entire life. "Would you like to be alone?" Diane asked. I shook my head. "Give me a minute. Then I'll call Sophie in." Diane nodded and stepped out, closing the door. That small click made the room absolutely silent. I stared at the envelope, hesitating like someone standing at the threshold of memory. I had read letters Margaret left in the safe, heard her voice in my mind, but this was a letter she had intentionally saved for last, a gift to be opened only after I had walked through the storm. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside were 2 handwritten pages and a neatly clipped stack of documents, stamped and printed. My hands trembled, not from age, but from fear. Fear that if I read, I would hear Margaret too clearly and be reminded she was truly gone. I opened the first page. "My dearest Ronald." Just those 3 words made my eyes burn. I swallowed, took a breath, and kept reading. "If you're reading this letter, it means you've done the hardest thing you always avoided. You stopped protecting people who didn't deserve your shelter. You'll think you were cruel, but you weren't. This isn't revenge. It's justice." I sat still. Images filled my mind. That fateful dinner, Laura looking at me like a disposable object, Ethan staring down, the sound of keys hitting wood. I had asked myself hundreds of times if I went too far, blamed myself for signing papers that closed every escape route. Margaret wrote exactly what I needed to hear. She understood me. From beginning to end, she always had. I kept reading, her handwriting steady like her breathing. "You always believed that if you stayed silent and endured, things would be calm. But calm that comes from letting others trample your dignity isn't calm, Ronald. It's turning yourself into a shadow. You didn't do that anymore. You stood up, even if standing up meant walking out quietly. You may not realize it, but that was strength." I set the letter down and pressed my hand to my chest. I heard rain tapping the window, the clock ticking. Ordinary sounds suddenly felt sharp, as if the world was making space for Margaret's voice. I turned to the second page. "There's one more thing you need to know. I didn't only prepare to protect you from Laura, I prepared to protect Sophie from any future she didn't choose. The year Sophie started middle school, I opened a college fund in her name. I contributed little by little, quietly, from an account Laura never knew about. I did it not because I doubted Sophie, but because I believed she would need freedom. Freedom to learn, to live, to not have others decide for her. I looked at the clipped documents below. That was what she meant. A complete education fund file, the name printed clearly at the top. Sophie Miller Education Fund. The start date, much earlier than I had imagined. I read the total and had to close my eyes. Not because the amount was overwhelming, but because I understood Margaret had saved through years of fighting illness, quietly building a protective wall for our family. She still smiled, still cooked, still went to church, still talked like everything was normal. But inside, she had done the work of an entire army. I didn't cry right away. My throat tightened, then the tears came, hot and slow. I wasn't crying from pain anymore. I was crying from gratitude. Gratitude for a woman who saw what I missed and chose to love me by protecting me, even when she wouldn't be here to see the outcome. I wiped my face and stood, opening the door. Diane was waiting in the hallway. I spoke, my voice hoarse. "Please, call Sophie in." Sophie entered a few minutes later, her hoodie pulled high against the cold, a few raindrops clinging to her hair. She looked at me, then at the letter on the table. I saw hesitation in her eyes, as if she were afraid to touch something sacred. "You called me?" Sophie asked. I nodded, pulling out a chair for her. "Sit. This is from your grandmother." Sophie sat very slowly. She held the letter like something fragile. I didn't rush her. I let her open it, read it on her own. I sat across from her, watching every small change on her face. When Sophie reached the line, "This isn't revenge, it's justice," her lips trembled slightly. She looked up at me without speaking, but I understood. She was rearranging everything in her mind. The days in the old house, her mother's cold words, her father's silence, and now her grandmother's voice reaching back from the past, clear and gentle. Then Sophie reached the part about the college fund. She let out a very small sound. "Grandma, set up a fund for me?" I handed her the stack of papers. She did it a long time ago. She thought of everything ahead of time. Sophie looked at her name on the documents. She bit her lip, tears falling onto the first page. She wiped them away quickly, as if afraid of smudging the paper, as if afraid of disturbing her grandmother. Ethan was standing in the doorway. I hadn't heard his footsteps. He must have just arrived, following his habit of knocking lightly and stepping in because Diane allowed it. Ethan looked at Sophie, then at me, then at the letter. He didn't say anything. He just stood there like someone witnessing something he should have seen much earlier. Sophie turned to Ethan. Her gaze held no blame anymore, just exhaustion and honesty. "Dad," Sophie said softly, "Grandma believed in me." Ethan nodded, his eyes red. "I know. Not an immediate, 'I'm sorry.' But that 'I know' was the first step of someone who had spent too long hiding behind silence. Sophie took a breath, wiped her tears, then said something that surprised me. "I want to study architecture." I tilted my head. "Architecture?" She nodded. "I want to design things that last. Houses, bridges, places that make people feel safe. I don't want to live in a house where every day you're afraid of being pushed out." I looked at Ethan. I looked at Sophie. I looked at Margaret's letter. And in that moment, I understood why Margaret chose to leave this letter for last, not to show me that I had beaten Laura, but to show me that I had saved something far more important: Sophie's future, and the chance for Ethan to become the man he had forgotten how to be. I leaned forward, placing my hand on the tabletop, feeling the cool grain of the wood under my fingertips. I had been called a burden. I had been treated as useless. But now, looking at my granddaughter holding her grandmother's letter like a lantern, looking at my son standing still with nowhere left to hide, I realized something with calm clarity. I was never weak. I had just taken too long to believe that I deserved respect. A year passed faster than I expected. Time kept flowing like a river, never stopping for anyone. But strangely, I no longer felt swept along by it. I lived in a small house near the workshop, nothing fancy, nothing to show off. In the mornings, I woke early to make coffee, opened the window to let sunlight fill the kitchen, listened to birds tapping out a rhythm on the awning. Some days were so peaceful, I had to remind myself that peace, too, is a kind of victory. Sophie went to college. She chose a school that fit her, not too far so she could still come home once a month, but far enough to stand on her own. On move-in day, I brought a small toolbox I had made myself. Inside were a tape measure, a pencil, a tiny level, and a thin piece of oak with her name carved into it. I told her, "Life is like building a house. Measure carefully before you cut. Think carefully before you promise." Sophie smiled and hugged me for a long time. My shoulder grew warm with her tears, but this time they weren't tears of fear. They were the tears of a child who finally saw a future. Ethan came back almost every weekend. Some Fridays he arrived early, helped me change the porch light, drove me to buy lumber, listened to me complain about gas prices like a proper old man. Other times, he only stopped by for a few hours, sat quietly with a cup of coffee, then suddenly said, "I'm learning how to be a dad again." I didn't lecture him. I just nodded and handed him a towel to dry his hands, as if passing along an ordinary task. Because often, what people need most isn't advice, but a place where they're allowed to start over. The relationship between Ethan and Sophie didn't return to what it once was right away. Once a crack appears, even if you fill it, the line remains. But I could see them trying. Ethan called Sophie more often, not to control her, but to ask small things. "What did you eat today? Is technical drawing hard? Do you need me to send money for books?" Sophie no longer answered with suspicion. She answered with caution and honesty. And I understood that caution was reasonable. Trust is like dry wood. If you want it to be strong, you have to give it time. One autumn afternoon, Ethan and I took Sophie out to eat at a small restaurant near her campus. The cold was just enough to make people want to sit closer together. Sophie talked about her classes, her design assignments, about how she loved watching a drawing turn from straight lines into a space you could actually walk into. Ethan listened closely, smiling sometimes, touching his glass now and then as if to steady himself. I watched them, then looked at my own hands, fingers marked with calluses and wrinkles. I used to think growing old meant being left behind. But the truth is, growing old can be the moment you choose who gets to stay in your life. Another day, on the way home, I saw Laura from a distance. I wasn't looking for her. I wasn't avoiding her either. Life sometimes places people in the same frame so you can see change clearly without saying a word. Laura stood in front of a grocery store, her hair tied back hastily, her coat too thin for the cold. She no longer had the confident look that once made others step aside. She stared into space the way people look at something they've lost and don't know how to name. I watched her for a few seconds. No hatred, no satisfaction, just emptiness. Ethan saw her too. His grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. I placed my hand on his arm, a touch just enough to let him know we didn't need to turn back, and we didn't need to win again. Ethan let out a breath. The car rolled on. Laura didn't notice us, or maybe she did and didn't have the strength to react. I don't know, and I didn't need to know. I had lived in a house where I was treated like a guest. I had been called a burden. I had walked out of that kitchen with empty hands, no suitcase, no plan, only my self-respect rubbed raw and aching. But I stood firm, not because I was stronger than anyone else, but because I finally stopped trying to please people who treated my sacrifices like obligations. Now, standing in front of the workshop, hearing the steady sound of the plane against wood, seeing Sophie send me a photo of her first design drawing, watching Ethan learn how to listen to his daughter, I understand something simple. I don't need them to exist. I need respect to live with meaning. And when respect isn't there, I have the right to leave. The story you've just heard is a work of fiction, inspired by real-life situations and human experiences, meant to offer moral value, life lessons, and emotional resonance. It does not encourage imitation of any actions shown, nor does it incite or target any individual or organization. I believe the most important thing here isn't who won or lost, but the reminder that staying silent in the face of injustice can sometimes be a form of participation. Setting boundaries doesn't make you cold. It keeps you from being worn down. Understanding your legal rights, knowing which documents matter, knowing who can help you, that's how you protect yourself in real life, especially as you grow older and others think you're easy to manipulate. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, don't rush into blind confrontation fueled by anger. Find someone who understands the law, a trustworthy lawyer, or an organization that protects older adults where you live. calm, informed action is always stronger than loud words. And listen to your intuition, because sometimes your heart recognizes danger before your mind does. Family is not a place where you're made to feel small. Family is where you're safe, respected, and allowed to be yourself without asking permission. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt like a burden or been abandoned in your own home, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future videos. You can also share this video with a friend, a family member, or anyone who needs to hear that they're not alone and that they have the right to stand up in the calmest way possible. And if you'd like, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, which city, which state, or simply say that you're doing okay. Other stories are still waiting for you here, and I'm truly grateful that you took the time to listen all the way to the very end.